Good evening, and welcome to the John F. Kennedy Jr. Forum at the Institute of Politics. My name is Wyeth. I'm a sophomore studying history and literature at the college, and I'm a member of the JFK Jr. Forum Committee. Before we begin, please note the exit doors, which are located on both the Park side and JFK Street side of the forum. In the event of an emergency, walk to the exit closest to you and congregate in JFK Park. Please also take a moment now to silence your cell phones. And join me in welcoming the organizers of the 2026 Mexican Conference, Liz Valdez and Roberto Andrade.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the JFK Junior Forum at the Harvard Kennedy School. My name is Roberto Andrade.
And I'm Liz Valdez. We are both students at the Master in Public Policy here at the Kennedy School, and we are co-chairs of this year's Mexico Conference. It is a real pleasure to see so many students, faculty, and guests joining us today.
We are especially grateful to begin the 2026 Mexico Conference in collaboration with the Institute of Politics. The IOP has long been a space where leadership, democracy, and public life come together, and we are delighted that we could partner with them to open this conversation.
The theme of this first panel could not be more timely: shared growth, Mexico's vision for economic prosperity and cooperation with the United States. At a moment when global economic integration is being reconsidered, the relationship between the United States and Mexico remains one of the most dynamic and consequential partnerships in the world.
To help us explore this topic, we are honored to be joined by two outstanding leaders whose work span both research and public service across Mexico and the United States. Our panelist tonight is Senator Alejandro Murat, who currently chairs the Foreign Relations Committee in the Mexican Senate. He previously served as the governor of Oaxaca, where his administration focused on reducing poverty, expanding infrastructure, and promoting regional economic development. He also published the book, More Oaxaca in the World, The Foundations of the Interoceanic Corridor, articulating his vision of regional prosperity.
We are also very thankful as our conference faculty advisor is serving as moderator of this important discussion. Gordon Hanson is a Peter Wertheim professor in urban policy here at HKS. His research on globalization, labor markets, and regional economic change, along with his Reimagining the Economy project, has helped reshape how economists and policymakers understand the effects of economic prosperity.
We are grateful to both of our panelists for joining us today to discuss the future of economic cooperation between Mexico and the United States.
And with that, please join us in welcoming Senator Alejandro Murat and Professor Gordon Hanson.
Here with our country's respective flags behind us, I feel like we're preparing for the Copa Mundial. So it's a real pleasure to be with you today, Senator, and I'm delighted to have this conversation to open the Mexico Conference. Mexico is near and dear to my own heart. It's how I got started as an academic. I spent a year in Mexico doing research for my dissertation, which was about the developing relationship between the United States and Mexico. And I thought we might start our conversation there with your role as chairing the Foreign Relations Commission on the Mexican Senate. And we are in a moment of transition, we might say, in terms of how the US and Mexico are relating to each other, driven by the demands that the United States is placing on its various trading partners in terms of reorganizing a set of global economic relationships that had been established for several decades. The North American Free Trade Agreement becoming the US-Mexico-Canada Agreement was foundational for what that global economic order looked like. And now we're trying to imagine what will come next. Prime Minister Mark Carney in Canada has called this moment a rupture. Mexico has perhaps navigated these difficulties better than almost any other country. President Sheinbaum has drawn admiration for the deftness with which she has handled a very important relationship for her country, but a complicated one. So I wonder if you might start by giving us your sense of where the U.S.-Mexico relationship is today, and we think about establishing paths forward that can maintain that closeness and the mutual gain that we have derived from an economic relationship that deepened dramatically 3 decades ago, but now is at a moment of precariousness.
Thanks, Gordon. And thanks, everybody. It's a great opportunity to be here today with you. Clearly, we all know that there's big geopolitical change right now in the world. But I think it's a great moment of opportunity if you read through the lines. And I believe this because clearly the context of what Mexico represents with the US and Canada and what they've been able to build together should be the way we should analyze things. Because if we analyze the fundamentals, and I always bring Jeff Bezos to the table, because he says that he doesn't focus on the first question. He says, the first question is what's going to change? He focuses on the second question. And the second question is what's not going to change? And what's not going to change with Mexico and the US is that we're neighbors and that we have more than 3,000 kilometers of opportunities that we've been able to build. If we were entrepreneurs and maybe 30 years ago we thought about this economic relationship, would we have foreseen that it represents 30% of global GDP? That we don't have a commercial pact, that it's a co-production supply chain? And not only economically, we need to understand what unites us. And what unites us are the values, the principles. We're two great democracies. We have to look at what's happened in Mexico in the last 25 years. I started doing politics 25 years ago. And I've seen in the federal government, in the state governments, in the municipal governments, different parties governing. We can see that in the Senate. We can see that in Congress. And we can see that with our society. It's more mature. And we've been able to build strong institutions. Electorally speaking, the rule of law. We are societies that defend free speech, that defend the free religion, and we've been able to have capital markets. And I think that if we focus on those things, we can understand that going forward, we will only have to unite more. Clearly, as neighbors, we will have challenges. And even though geopolitically things are changing, if you analyze the 3 areas that today are in the focus of the Mexican agenda and the US agenda, it's not new. If we analyze it going back 30 years, migration, security, and commerce. But what's been the difference, Gordon? And I think you mentioned it. We need to understand that personal relations are still the fundamentals. And if we analyze that, we can understand why President Sheinbaum has been able to construct a basic fundamental in politics: confidence. President Sheinbaum has been able to have maybe 16 telephone or calls with President Trump. And they talk like neighbors, neighbors here in any community. It's just the scale that changes, right? And in those conversations, clearly, President Trump pushes forward his agenda, and President Sheinbaum also listens, because in politics, dialogue and capacity to listen is fundamental. And when you listen, you can generate resolutions. And if you see what has happened after those conversations, migration, we now have the lowest level of illegal or different type of migration in the history of both countries. It's at 95%. But we also have seen President Trump come out and say, hey, out of those 40 million first, second, and third generation Mexicans, 13 may not have the right immigration status, but we know, just so you can have an example, that 1 million work in construction, 1 million work in agriculture, 1 million work in services. And what has he acknowledged? That those Mexicans generate value to the U.S. economy and its culture. And when we think about security, we can also understand that President Sheinbaum pushes forward on her agenda on security. Because in the discourse in different levels, many people come out and say it's the U.S. pushing forward. No, that was part of her agenda as a candidate, because she was successful as jefa de gobierno in Mexico, and now she's implementing the same strategy in security. And it's like baseball, you're giving hits. If we analyze, the numbers, just so you can have, homicides. It started at 25%, now it's 42%. Clearly, if you're having hits, you can have one of those big moments like the one we had around a week ago, where coordination was fundamental. But the execution was made by the security forces of Mexico. And some ambassadors from all over the world ask me, why didn't President Sheinbaum try to take, the opportunity to make a big deal out of what happened 2 weeks ago? And this is important so you can understand, because it's part of the Mexican agenda. As you know, in the past, we declared war to the cartels. You declare war between nations. In societies, you implement the rule of law. And I think that's the biggest message that we have to take as a takeaway from what happened 2 weeks ago. It doesn't matter if you are white-collar crime and have to pay taxes, if you're a cartel boss, or you're just a criminal. You need to understand that in Mexico, what we're trying to do is reverse the rate of impunity and apply the rule of law. And we are doing it with all the capacities on the board. And clearly, coordination between the United States and Mexico is part of the solution. And then the third element, commerce. And what's the big news that came out yesterday? That this month, at the end of the month, we are going to start formal conversations on the review of USMCA. So if, we analyze again through the lines, we might think that, hey, maybe we're doing something right together. And once again, the challenges that our relation as neighbors, as partners, is having the success that both of our societies require. It doesn't matter the style of who's in charge. It doesn't matter the agenda of who's in charge. If you understand that in politics, the basic fundamental is to establish dialogue, to establish conversation, to understand what your counterpart wants. And I think there's where you can understand the success of what's happening today between Mexico, the US, and also Canada. And that's why I am also, I think that we have more future than present between our countries' relationships. And then we can go into other areas of public policy, but I think that you were thinking about that, Gordon. So.
No, thank you very much, Senator. And as we think about the foundation for that relationship, you talk about what we've achieved over the last 30 years, the strength of those business ties, the strength of the Mexican community that's in the United States. That creates a constituency that's hard to turn your back on, but that is also there to pressure the United States government to make sure that we don't do lasting damage to one of our most important relationships. Hard as it may be for us to admit, it's international relations is not all about the United States. It's about other countries too. And Mexico faces this challenge now, thinking about what is its role in Latin America. And its role in Latin America has been remarkable. During the Cold War, Mexico offered refuge to dissidents who were fleeing violence and persecution in their own countries. Many of those dissidents turned out to be some of the greatest artists of the 20th century. Luis Buñuel, Gabriel Garcia Marquez, Pablo Neruda all spent time in Mexico City, but so did politicians. So did Fidel Castro. And Mexico has had a role in helping Cuba maintain its relations with the rest of the region, helping tone down the tensions between the United States and Cuba. And so now with this, the U.S. taking a newly interventionist stance, Mexico with its long history of advocating for non-aligned nations, how do we think about kind of the principles that will be guiding the way in which Mexico addresses and works with its neighbors to the south?
Well, for us, it's very clear. You know, the easy thing is that we have our Constitution, and in Article 89, it's very clear how we have to implement our foreign relations. And I think that's part of the strength that Mexico has. And the first thing is that we're clearly in favor of multilateralism. We're in favor of international law. And in the Constitution, it is drafted very clearly that we are a country that is against intervention, that we are a country that respects sovereignty and independence of each country or state, and that we're in favor of peace, of building peace. And I think if we maintain that position, we become that a player that can unite other countries that don't have those elements in their foreign relations. Because when conflict arises, there's countries like Mexico that, given their history, as you just mentioned, Gordon, we can push forward to generate the right conversations, to generate the stability of the region. And clearly, that's one of our purposes. The other purpose is sustainable development. And I think clearly the US and Mexico have that in common. And we can generate the right agenda so that our neighbors to the south can have different policies that can change structurally depending on the economics, the politics, or other issues like culture. But I think that it's important for us to be very clear, especially when we consider that we have sort of a little asymmetric relation with the US, that we defend sovereignty. that we defend multilateralism, that we defend international law, because that gives us a level playing field for everybody. And I think that's what's given the opportunity of our society as a whole, as a global whole, to achieve what we've been achieving in many areas of our societies. If conflict is the one that prevails, clearly a lot of issues will arise. And we have to question that also. We have to question if, in that sense, if we don't push forward that agenda, if maybe democracy as a system might lose legitimacy, if public faith can erode those democratic principles, because at the end of the game, we need to understand that societies are not static. They're living beings. And democracy as a whole has to deliver. And I think that's the most important part. But when you are set on your principles, and this is with what I would close, and those principles for us are non-intervention, sovereignty, and peace.
We in the United States have certainly given you, as head of the Foreign Relations Commission, the U.S. Senate, a lot to do to keep you busy in your current job. Let's move from foreign relations to domestic issues and go back to your time as governor of Oaxaca. And I'd like to start with just your Mexico has had its challenges with regional economic divides, something that it has in common with the United States. The left-behind regions in the U.S. are one of the central economic challenges of our times and have contributed to the political polarization that we're living through right now. Sometimes we approach those divides just thinking about poverty alleviation, taking care of people who are facing challenges. Other times we think about it in a longer run sense of how do we generate local economic development that can be long-lived and that can be transformational. And I know that was something distinctive about the approach that you brought to your time as governor of Oaxaca. So let's talk about that approach, and then we'll weave in some insights that we've developed here at the Kennedy School about taking on similar sets of issues.
The first thing that I would tell you is that we need to understand what we want as a society. And I'll go one step back. Today in Mexico, the policies that are being pushed forward are policies that want us to grow, but want us to grow more equally. And I think that's the biggest challenge today in the world. The concentration of the rich and the poor. And as you mentioned, Gordon, the U.S. is one of those countries that is very rich, but very unequal. Germany is a similar economy that's very rich, but more equal. So we need to question ourselves what we want in Mexico. And I think that those questions are being answered today. And basically, that's what I wanted also as a governor. You need to understand that as governors, and I like to acknowledge Governor Mauricio Vila, which I worked with together in Yucatan, who is here. And we both, I think, did face challenges, but I think we were successful. And let me tell you why. First, because you need to understand in Economics 101, right? They tell you what generates structural change. And there's two variables fundamentally. The change of the business model or the policy model or technology, right? So in Mexico, we implemented a change in the policy model, because we understood that it doesn't matter if you grow if dignity doesn't advance together. They go hand by hand. because you need social mobility. You need wage mobility. You need infrastructure in communities. You need investment in the regions. And sometimes just focusing on growth doesn't give you a solution for those issues. But you have to start from down up in the pyramid. It's not trickle-down economics. And that's why I think that the transfer system of social programs is great. Today, for example, we have around 28 billion, if I'm not wrong, in the budget for social programs in Mexico. Half of them go to education. But why is that important? It won't bring structural change, but it gives you the opportunity to confront the day-to-day issues with more patience and capacity for change. And when you see those policies and see the fundamentals, you can see that summed up with the salary change, the basic salary change, we can see that 13 million people of Mexicans came out of poverty, and 2 million came out of extreme poverty. And I think that makes Mexico more equal, and that's great. But that also gives you the opportunity to do the structural changes that you require. And when you think about Mexico, it's, you know, when I started as governor, I started analyzing, you know, those case studies of other countries like Singapore, which is great, or the case of Shanghai and China. But then I realized that in Mexico, we have great case studies. Let me give you these two examples. If you analyze the north of Mexico, and if you analyze the last 15 years, the states in the north have grown steadily between 6 and 8% GDP annually. If you see the center or the Bajío region, you will see that they have grown between 4 and 6% steadily annually. If you compare it with India or China, we're there. The last 15 years. So why didn't the Mexican economy change? Well, because the equation doesn't give when you consider the south of Mexico. Because in the south, we were not growing. Actually, it was the other way around. So what happened when I became governor? And it's the quick hits. In consulting, they tell you quick hits. And my biggest quick hit was that I had a president that wanted to generate structural change in the south. Because clearly, Oaxaca doesn't have the tax collection to build the interoceanic corridor, or doesn't have the tax collection to build 2 highways that I built between Oaxaca and the coast of Puerto Escondido or Oaxaca in the Istmo region. Because when we think about this economics 101, for a state, what is the technological change? Highways. Because connectivity makes change. Or railways. And what happened in the tenure of President López Obrador? He built 3,000 kilometers of railways. Where? In the south. So the first circuit of railways between Tren Maya and the interoceanic corridor are not in the center of Mexico, are not in the north of Mexico, they're in the south of Mexico. And that gives us the connectivity and clearly the technical structural change that we needed to change that trajectory, Gordon. Because clearly we won't change poverty overnight. But the greatness of public policy is that we can change the trajectory when we take the right decisions. So for me, it was easy. I had a president that was giving me all the money that my state required to generate the structural changes that we needed. And just to give you one other example, if you visited Mexico, you know that Nuevo León is the industrial state of Mexico. But you know why it's the industrial state of Mexico? Because it was the first state that received gas in Mexico. And we all know that gas means cheap energy. And cheap energy means industrialization. When do you think gas arrived to Oaxaca? The 5th year of my governorship. So how can Oaxaca have industrialization if we didn't have gas? It's clear, because the federal governments were focused, and it's part of history. They were first focused on the north with gas, and then NAFTA, and then they established a trust in the Bajío region that was able to transform agriculture of rain to agro-industry. And then after agro-industry came the aerospace industry and the automotive industry. So what we needed to do in the South was generate that structural change. And let me put this example, which is, I think it impacted me when it happened, when I was governor. A guy from Guanajuato comes to Oaxaca one day. And he was the top, he had the industry of shoes. As you know, in Guanajuato, and if you don't know, Guanajuato is known to be the capital of shoes and boots in Mexico. And he came to me and he said, "Governor, I need to put a plant in Oaxaca of shoes." And I was like, "Why do you want to bring a plant? I'm happy, I'm excited. But the capital of shoes is in Guanajuato." And this is what he answered. He said, "Yes, I know, but the new generation doesn't want to be the artisan of shoes. The new generation wants to be the engineer of the aerospace industry. The new generation wants to be the engineers of the cars industry." And that's what we want for the south of Mexico. The capacity to choose. Because economic integration is senseless if you don't put the variable of human opportunity in the equation. And that's what I did when I was in Oaxaca. I understood that in politics, in policy, in the administration, you need to transform. You need to have that courage to reform. If you do that, you can generate the structural change. Because I think there was a moment where we became too focused on spreadsheets and forgot the human variable in the equation. So when I was governor, clearly I had two planes. The immediate day-to-day, because that's also important to understand, issues will come up every day. You know, when I was, I sometimes did this small reflection with people. You know, I don't know if this happened to you, but when we went to school and we had math class, you know, the math teacher comes up and says, "Surprise, math quiz," right? Well, for me as a governor, every day in the morning was my math quiz, a surprise. And you had 24 hours to generate a solution, because the next day you would have another big issue. But then you have the other strategic short, medium, and term planning. And that's what I did. I understood that there's economies of scale, that there are areas that will impact the economy very fast, like tourism and construction, and started focusing on that in the short term. But in the medium and long term, I had the opportunity, because I think that that was also an opportunity in history, of having a president. Clearly, all presidents love their country and love all the states the same, but they don't have the budgets or the time to focus everywhere. And this president wanted to focus on the South, and clearly in the center of the South was Oaxaca. And I took the opportunity of establishing a good relation so that that could become part of the budget of the state and generate the structural changes that Oaxaca needed. And the most important were clearly the highways, the interoceanic, but also hospitals. Let me tell you, because we had the pandemic. And when I started my tenure, in my plan, there were many hospitals abandoned. So in my plan, I didn't know there was going to be a pandemic. But I was able to finish the biggest hospital in all of the south of Mexico before the pandemic, and 3 other hospitals. So when the pandemic arrived, I didn't have the money to start operating them. But I had President López Obrador. So when he visited Oaxaca, and let me tell you something else, he visited 105 times Oaxaca. 10% of his time was in Oaxaca. But for me, that was important. It's not about a personal relationship. It's about results. And the results was that I could put in operation all those hospitals. And when the pandemic arose, clearly we were in a very good position to save lives. So basically, that's how I focused in my tenure in Oaxaca. Structural change, because that's what really gives you the leap to change things and have the courage and the patience to listen. And then you can build sustainable growth.
Very shortly, we're going to be opening things up to questions from the audience. We've got 4 microphones around the room, so if folks would like to line up. I'm going to ask one final question. We'll try and have this be a short one, although it's not a short topic, so I'm warning you. And that has to do with some of the choices you were talking about regarding the future trajectory for Oaxaca. And this is a debate we're having inside the Kennedy School right now, is in regions that are not at the top of the income distribution, what are their avenues for economic progress? Historically, that's been attracting manufacturing. That was how northern Mexico developed. In the United States, manufacturing also started in the north, later moved to the south, and that's what helped the southern part of the United States develop after 1950. But manufacturing is complicated today, in part because there's this country called China, which keeps its presence in global markets to a substantial degree. Oaxaca's been very successful on the tourism front, but I'm wondering whether you have thought about industries beyond manufacturing and tourism that might tie into some of the infrastructure investments that you've considered as part of the Oceanic Corridor, train, railways, and so forth, that might then broaden the set of sectors that could propel local development.
Yes, definitely. Well, you know, the way I think global geopolitics is going is basically the way we approached Oaxaca. Just to let me give you this point. I believe that what Prime Minister Carney, President Trump, and President Sheinbaum are doing, strengthening the local economies, is awesome. I think that's the right way going forward. The pandemic showed us that, you know, supply chains make us vulnerable. And we need to focus on our strengths, but also on the other areas that make us fragile. And in Oaxaca, what I did was understand that regions have vocation, even in the interoceanic corridor. And change is gradual. Clearly, if I came up to you and told you that today in Oaxaca we could be developing heavy industrialized areas, it would be a little complicated to get there overnight. Or semiconductors, for example. But the way we established the project, because we have a plan, and that's also important for you to remember. The most important is have a plan, and then second, execute. Because many times nobody executes. And that's, I think, the biggest challenge in public policy and in the administration of government. But the way we had the plan is that we understand that clearly Oaxaca has its first, its fast win, is agriculture. In Oaxaca, I had the opportunity to build the first agro park. Imagine that. We didn't even have an agro park. And 50% of our economy is agriculture. But it was agriculture of rain. And we started doing the agro park. So what we understand is that the first fast win, not only for Oaxaca, but also all the states of the South, but because almost all of the states of the South, except maybe Tabasco, because it has, the petroleum, or some areas of Veracruz. Basically, it's tourism or agriculture. So our fast win is just to scale up the agro industry of all the region, because now we have the trains. We have these circuits of train, and then we have Coatzacoalcos in Veracruz, in Veracruz, and then we have in Salina Cruz port. We have the port that goes to Asia, and in Coatzacoalcos the other area that goes to Europe. So we have these connections, and then we have the U.S. And then in the next phase, once we start consolidating this project of the interoceanic corridor, it's like a Lego. It's gradual. You build it as long as the demand starts getting heavier. Then you can go to the secondary element, which is industrialization. And then we can start from small industrialization to very heavy industrialized products. And then what will happen after that? The services industry. So the way we see it is that in the next 15 years, and this is in the plan, the interoceanic corridor can represent 12% of Mexican GDP. Clearly, the most important thing is direct investment, because the game changer is that. You need to have direct investment in a vertical model, because clearly with the pandemic, almost all companies changed from horizontal models of supply production to vertical models, and that's the opportunity for us. Now, what we have to do is execute. We have 10 economic zones, so we also did the work there. We have 10 economic zones that give you, we have 13 international treaties besides the USMCA. We have one stop for regulation. And we have human capital to work on that. Now, what we have to work on is develop those economic zones to have the tax benefits, the trade benefits or commercial benefits, human capital, and build so that in the next 15 years we can clearly see what I've just told you happen. And that's a great opportunity and the game changer for us. And clearly, if the United States, this is another element that I believe that we have to build it, of course, is that this area can become the first industrialized area for USMCA. Because clearly, if you put in the equation the variable of immigration from the southern states, Central America and the South, clearly we have an area that can accommodate the jobs that the region requires. So if we see it as an integral project, not only from Mexico point of view, but also the US and Canada, we will have a great game changer of USMCA.
Fantastic. So now we're going to enjoy the opportunity of hearing from our wonderful students here at the Kennedy School and at Harvard. Please keep your questions as questions rather than as contributions, and try and keep the questions brief so that we can get as many folks on the dais as possible. So we'll start over here, please.
Hi, thank you, Senator and Professor Hanson, for this introduction. I am Karime Barron, PhD student in political science. Senator, you talk about the US-Mexico relation at the international level, and it calls my attention you made the comparative of our democracy, saying that our state of law and our institutions are strong, which I agree, but I also disagree at the same time. I think Mexico has very strong institutions, but very strong informal institutions. In the north, in the Bajío, in the south, as you mentioned. I think it's a cancer through the whole country, and it's not a secret. So in that domestic level, I would like to ask you two questions. Does the current government or the Morena party acknowledge the informality of these institutions? And which ones are you working on? What is the agenda to revert this path? Sorry, those are three questions.
Can you be more specific on what informal institutions, just to...
I would say in general, just the first ones that come to your mind.
Just all the institutions?
Well, the most informal institutions you identify as a senator and a policymaker.
Well, okay, so clearly there's an area, and I'm going to tell you this, it's something a minister in finance once told me. And he said, clearly I won't tell his name, but he said, if you ever tell my name, I will say I never said that. But I think that an opportunity for Mexico, but the biggest problem in Mexico, he said, we don't have unemployment because everybody in the economy is informal. So clearly, Mexicans know how to work, but we haven't had the capacity of, as a state, as a government, to show them the benefits of financial inclusion. And clearly, that is one of the biggest challenges that Mexico has, because if we can convert that productivity that is informal today in Mexico and convert it into the formal sector, we would be unstoppable. Because all of these small entrepreneurs, because this is what they are, they generate against all odds. But I think that we need to continue to analyze why we haven't had the capacity to generate the policies so that we have all of that productive sector of the Mexican economy in the formal sector. Clearly, I think that we still have to work on corruption as a whole, as a system. We need to be accountable in both sides of the aisle. And we need to work on that as a society. I think that clearly there are challenges today in our institutions, but I think I do believe that our democracy is strong enough to establish a conversation and to give us, the way to strengthen certain institutions. For example, the judicial power. I do believe that we need a change. I think that still if you see it as a system, all the areas of law enforcement, prosecution, and court administration should be strengthened. And if we do that, and I think there are many policies being pushed forward that will become and give us results that our society wants to reduce the biggest problem that I believe we have today, which is the impunity rate. And, but in order to achieve that, the whole system has to work. And I think we've done the changes. I do believe that. For example, as a senator, we passed more than 6 laws in the area of court system, because I don't know if we have time, but this is a little long. But
let's
yeah.
Why don't we?
Those are,
want to make sure we.
Sorry.
I know we've got a lot of folks that want to jump in. Please.
Hello, thank you for the talk and for your service. I think there's a lot the United States could learn from you and from Mexico, especially in growing equally. I'm a student at Harvard Law School. My mom was born in Mexico. You make me very proud to have Mexican roots, so thank you. My question has to do with the Trump administration clearly wanting to do regime change in Cuba and creating a humanitarian crisis there, which goes against international law. My question is, how can Mexico be for non-intervention, for sovereignty, while pausing oil shipments to Cuba, which puts the Cuban people at risk? Just simply, why did they stop oil shipments and, to harm Cuban people? From the outside here in America, it honestly looks like it goes against Mexico's principles and policies of sovereignty, non-intervention. So that's my question. Thank you again.
No, thank you. Great question. We didn't stop the shipments of goods. There have been 2 shipments that have gone out of Mexico to the Cuban people. What did stop was the shipments of petroleum. And that is part of our good neighbor sort of relation, I think, with the U.S. But we have not stopped the shipments of goods, of basic goods, for humanitarian reasons to Cuba.
Okay, thank you.
I don't.
Please.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor. Thank you, Senator. I have a question for the Senator, maybe also for the Professor. So some people might say that the U.S. is not a reliable partner, business partner anymore. And I want to know, so what should Mexico do to protect itself from the U.S. democratic and ideological volatility? Thank you.
Well, I always approach things this way. And I think that's how President Sheinbaum has approached it. You need to understand first what you can control and what you cannot control. And what can you control? What happens in your country. And I think that's why we have to be very optimistic, because President Sheinbaum came forward with a plan which is called Plan Mexico. And Plan Mexico is an initiative to impact the regions in Mexico, 15 actually, 15 economic zones in Mexico that will consider the regional economic vocations of Mexico. And in that sense, clearly generate the investments so that those regions can detonate and, at the end of the day, have a stronger economy. And I think that's the right path. Now, this isn't the only thing she's doing. I don't know if you know, but USMCA represents 80% of the Mexican economy. That is why it was so important for her to maintain a great level of confidence with President Trump and the US administration, which I believe up to today has reflected. But that doesn't mean that she doesn't have other alternatives which she's pushing forward, which is diversifying our markets. So first you have a strong local market, but then you look to Europe. And in March, we will be signing the new advanced treaty with the European Union. Now, why is this important? Look at these numbers. Mexico and the US are about to achieve $1 trillion economy. With Europe, Mexico has 80 billion. Now, if you see the European market, it's about 400 million people. The US is 280 million, and it has the same GDP per capita. Now, the question is, why haven't we been able to take advantage? Because we had this treaty before, now we have modernized it and we have agriculture and other areas. Well, because it was very easy to make, commerce with the US, and it was part of the day-to-day lives of the companies. And now what we need to establish with the European Union is an agency that helps for the compliance and opens those markets. Now, we're also working on a new treaty with Brazil. And with Asia, in the last period of the Senate, we passed an initiative of 25% tariffs to all the countries that did not have a treaty with us. Why is this important? Because the other partner of Mexico, the second economy, is China. And China represents around 200 billion. Now, the thing is that China, I don't know if you've studied the model, but they did a globalized model where basically they produce, subsidized everything by the state, and they export. So we don't have a level playing field in the world. Just let me give you an example. If you subsidize 100% of steel in a refrigerator, GE will not be able to compete even if they produce it in Mexico like it happens, with the 25% tariff that we implemented. And that's called dumping. So we are open to those economies and those companies of China to invest in Mexico. That's what we want. Because clearly that's the model, economic model that we have established in the world. And so those are some of the policies that President Sheinbaum controls, that Mexico controls, and that should impact clearly the Mexican economy. And those are the things that we're doing. And we are doing other things, but I don't know if we have more time, so
we're
that's
almost at the end. I would like to fit in one more question. The question is going to have to be brief. Unfortunately, the answer is going to have to be brief too.
Yes.
Please.
Yes, thank you. Hi, Senator. My name is Daniel Alegre. I'm an alum at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy, and I'm cross-registered here at the Kennedy School. One of my first jobs was under your tenure at Infonavit. So I wanted to ask you in the same line as Professor Hanson on Latin American leadership, and wondering if you could comment on what is your perspective of the original exclusion of a Mexican delegation to the counter-cartel conference and the Shield of America Leaders Summit happening this weekend in Florida, where other Latin American leaders are convening with President Trump, and how is the Senate and legislative perspective of this happening?
You mean that we were excluded?
Yes, that Mexico was not invited. Yeah.
Well, no, I would see it the other way around. There's always perspectives. And I think that I would focus on what we know and what's important. What's important? That President Trump and President Sheinbaum have had more than 16 conversations on the telephone. and that we have the greatness that President Sheinbaum has every day a news conference in the morning, and that President Trump uses social media to inform us of the agenda that he has, and that in the issues that are important for our bilateral relation, we've been able to have results. And it's not what I say, because I always say, look at the fundamentals. And when you see the fundamentals, you can cite, for example, Secretary Rubio, which went to Mexico and recognized that we have had the best historical relation against crime. Not only that, but an issue that was not touched in the bilateral agenda, like arms. I don't know if you know, but out of 100% of arms that are taken in a criminal activity, confiscated, 80% come from the U.S. And the U.S. administration has acknowledged that and is taking steps to reverse that. So we have worked together. Many of the initiatives, I can tell you, that we passed in the Senate have had some conversations with our U.S. counterparts. For example, the financial systems. You know about the amparo. Many people said, hey, this is affecting the basic rights of the people. No, we just did some small adjustments, for example, so that cartels should not use the financial systems as an area to avoid the law. And they were doing that with the amparo. Now they won't be able to do that. So what I would say is that for me, one thing is the bilateral relation we have, which I think is constructed on results, confidence, and conversation every day. And then the three issues that are important for our agenda, which is USMCA, we're starting talks at the end of the month, in our fight against crime and the cartels. Clearly, we're having success, coordinating together. And in immigration, I think that we are also having success. And I hope that in the near future, we can talk about a different strategy in the immigration area.
So, Senator, this has been a real pleasure. You started the discussion today talking about the importance of the U.S.-Mexico relationship and the role of our presidents in cementing that relationship. Also important is these sorts of exchanges and the bringing together of students from Mexico to the United States, the work that our faculty here at Harvard do in Mexico, and the opportunities to have leaders from the country come to campus and share their insights. The second important source of collaboration that we have is jointly hosting the World Cup this summer. So we have great opportunities for collaboration going forward, and thank you very much.
One last thing. I'm sorry, but I'm from Oaxaca, and I have to invite you all to Oaxaca. Oaxaca has it all, so please visit Oaxaca. And I want to thank the Consul General Carlos Iriarte, which has been fundamental in our visit. And thank you to Harvard. Thank you very much.
And before everyone leaves,
in 10 minutes, we're going to be hosting the next panel, which is going to be about the bilateral relationship between Mexico and the US. We'll continue discussing the renegotiations of the free trade agreement. So what's coming next is you'll get out of this room, you'll walk to the main entrance, you'll find a group of our staff, human staff, that will guide you to the 5th floor of this beautiful building in which we will be hosting the next event. So thank you, muchas gracias y bienvenidos.